In this lesson, we're going to learn how to work interactively with PowerShell. So what we're going to try to cover is just a little bit of how the shell works, what shells are, and some of the keyboard commands and shortcuts that you might learn that will make it a little bit easier. First of all, let's take a look at what the shell in PowerShell means. Okay, let's back up just a little bit. An operating system is a software that orchestrates the input, output, and compute resources of a computer. The software applications are programs that we run to do work that the user wishes to perform. The work could be anything as simple as operating system maintenance tasks to as complex as running payroll for a large organization, or as fun as playing Minecraft or something like that. So the shell is a component of the operating system that allows the user to direct the operating system what programs to run. Another word for programs is called a command. We need a way to tell the operating system which program we want to execute. And there's two kind of shells, or two big classification of shells I want to talk about. The first one are what we call text-based shells, or we often also call them command line interfaces. The second type is what we call a graphical interface. A graphical interface is an interface where we primarily don't type commands in like we would in a command line interface, but we use a mouse to highlight pictures, graphics, or icons on the screen to instruct the operating system what to do. If you're familiar with Windows or OS X or any of the major operating systems, most of the client operating systems now have a graphical interface to help the user get things done. However, some things are a lot more difficult to do in a graphical interface than they are just by typing a command. We'll illustrate lots of those throughout this semester. So let's get back to this concept of a shell. Shells typically provide a couple basic services. One of the first services and one of the primary things that a shell does is it starts a program or initiates a process. The process could either be, the second thing a shell provides is a method to navigate the resources of this system. We'll talk about resource navigation a lot in a couple lessons, but for right now, you can kind of think of it as moving around the file system and seeing what resources are available for you to use. And then finally, some shells provide a programming language that helps automate tasks that are repetitive. This is where the beauty of a command line interface really shines. Typically, command line interfaces will often have a programming language associated with them, where most graphical shells don't. PowerShell is a CLI, so a command line interface, shell with a scripting language. The PowerShell language is a language that was created wholly new for PowerShell. It has a lot of syntax basis in the C programming language, so if you have a little bit of programming background in C, a lot of the commands will become quite familiar to you, with a little different twist on them. Let's talk about the first shell. Now, since PowerShell primarily or originally came out as just a Windows application, I'm going to talk about the Windows shell and then PowerShell in comparison to the Windows shell. So Windows has always had a command line interface. If we go way back to the starting of Microsoft operating systems, the first one was a command line operating system. It was MS-DOS. Through evolution, Microsoft came out with Windows, and when Windows was developed, it was primarily designed to be used graphically or with a graphical user interface, or GUI. So the command line interface is called command.exe, or the program CMD. The current icon looks like this. This is the command interface. So by running cmd.exe, this opens up the command line interface for Windows. This is the interface that's been around for a long time, and we'll compare and contrast that a little bit as we go through these next few minutes. Okay, you can run any program on your computer by typing just the program's name at the command prompt. All right, so let's go back out to that command prompt. Notepad is one of the most useful little utilities built into Windows. So if I type Notepad in the command prompt and just hit enter, that Notepad program is going to run. I can launch any program that I want by telling the shell interface which program to execute. All I need to know is the name of the program, and I might need to know where the program is. I'll explain that in just a minute. So let's launch another program. I'm going to type a program that is used for understanding the network on your computer. It's ipconfig. So if I type the program ipconfig and hit enter, it's going to tell me a lot of things about the networking on my computer. You can ignore all that stuff that came out of that. All you need to understand is we ran a program. So we can just run programs by typing their name in. So I just gave you an example of two programs that are included with the Windows operating system. In fact, it's interesting to note that most of the bulk of the stuff that we call Windows is really not the operating system. It's really a whole bunch of utilities or commands that ship with the operating system to help us do useful things with that operating system. Microsoft provides a reference online that lists a lot of the utilities that are included with Windows. You may have used some of them, but I'm guessing there's a lot of them you've never heard of. Let me show you what that looks like. This is the documentation for the command interface for Windows. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit because it will show us a reference or a list of all the commands that are available. And you can see in the A's we have append and ARP and ASSOC and AT, etc., etc. If I scroll down the list is kind of large. The list has somewhere around 300 or something like that. I don't know, I haven't counted them. Utilities that come with Windows to do all kinds of different things. A lot of these utilities are command line based, meaning they are designed to be executed from the command line and interfaced with on the command line. So if you need to know how to use one of these, you can simply click on it. So here's one called ARP. Click on it and this will give you the information about how ARP works. So there's a bunch of different utilities out there. Let's play around with one or two of them and show you how they work a little bit. Let's try one of the utilities. Just for fun, let's try that ARP. So if I type ARP and hit enter, ARP responded with a big blob of text here. Basically what it's telling me is I didn't give ARP enough information to do its job. And so it gave me some instructions. If you look down the list, you can see that somewhere down the list there we have that a -A, and it says that displays the current ARP entries. Now you're thinking, what's ARP? Well, it doesn't really matter what ARP is for our class, but if you're a networking guy, this tells us about what computers we know about on the network and their associated MAC and IP addresses. So if you were curious, that's what it does. If not, don't pay any attention to it. But let's issue the command again. The name of the command is ARP, and I want to add an additional bit of information. I'm going to add that -A to tell ARP what to do. So I'll hit enter, and now I got a list of a whole bunch of IP addresses and their associated MAC addresses. Now those numbers and stuff are not all that important, but that's just simply one of the commands. As you notice, there was nothing graphical about this command. This command was designed to be used on the command line interface, and the output provided from the command was designed to be displayed on a command line interface. So it's just textual in nature. So a lot of the utilities in Windows are command line, but a lot of them are also graphical. Let's do another example. Let's say that you wanted to change your network settings. Now, some of you may have changed network settings before, and to get to the network settings, it's a fairly laborious task of clicking on the Start menu and going through the Control Panel, and then it seems like every time Microsoft comes out with a new version of Windows 10, it's in a different location, and you're a whole bunch of clicks away. We can do the same thing from our command environment if we just know the name of the command, which happens to be ncpa.cpl. If I just type ncpa.cpl, that's going to automatically open my network control panel. It opened it up on my other monitor, so I had to scoot it across the screen. That's a whole lot easier to do than clicking through those half a dozen icons and menus and whatnot to get to the properties. So we can launch programs that are graphical in nature or command line in nature. Obviously, this network control panel applet is designed to be used graphically, whereas the ARP command was designed to be used from a command line interface. So which is better? Hey, one's not better. They're just different ways of accomplishing similar tasks. We've talked a little bit about shells and Windows command prompt, or the CMD prompt. Now let's talk about PowerShell. So the shell in the name of PowerShell literally means that it is a shell. So it's a shell a lot like cmd.exe. It's actually designed to be the replacement for command.exe. And what we mean by that is PowerShell has a lot more features that were never added into command.exe. The command prompt, cmd.exe, has a very, very limited language in it. You might remember batch files. That's really all the processing capability it has. PowerShell is designed to replace that and provide a new object-based shell to provide a command line interface in Windows. So it has lots of neat features. Let's take a look at some of the features in there. First of all, it supports all the internal commands that cmd.exe does. If we were to look at PowerShell, we can do the same things that we did in command.exe. So I could type notepad, and that's going to launch notepad. I could type arp-a, and it's going to do the same thing that it did in the command prompt. For PowerShell to be a replacement of the command prompt, it has to be backwards compatible with the command prompt. So all the stuff that you can do in cmd.exe, you can also do in PowerShell, and it'll behave pretty much the same way. So the learning curve to PowerShell, if you have some experience with the command prompt, is really shallow. You can do all the stuff that you already know how to do in the command prompt in PowerShell. PowerShell also allows us to directly evaluate statements. So what do I mean by that? PowerShell has a programming language built into it, and programming languages have the ability to evaluate expressions. Expressions are just a set of commands or a set of operators that tell the shell to perform some task. Here we are again in PowerShell, and let's say I want PowerShell to do some simple math for me. So let's say I want to take 42 times 15. I can just simply put 42 times 15 in PowerShell, hit enter, and it's going to immediately evaluate that expression and give us the answer. PowerShell is actually pretty smart too. It knows a lot of different kinds of math and a lot of different kinds of ways to represent things. You've heard of things like gigabytes and megabytes and stuff like that. PowerShell understands those things. I could say 25 megabytes divided by 10 kilobytes. And it's actually going to do that math for me too. So we say that PowerShell is an expression evaluator. We can give it an expression and it'll evaluate the answer to that expression. Okay, let's go back to running programs from a shell. We've kind of shown you how to do programs from a shell a little bit, but I want to add a little bit of clarification to it. So we've already learned that you can simply type the name of a program you want to run on the command line and press enter and it'll go ahead and run that program. Well, that's a little overly simplistic. It will only run those programs if the program happens to be in something that we call the search path. So what's the search path? The search path is a list of directories that the operating system will automatically look in for a program to see if it'll run. If our command that we want to run is in the search path, it will automatically run without us having to tell where to find the program. And all the commands that we've done so far were in our search path. I have a program that's not in the search path, and I can't run it directly. It's called HXD. Let me just show you. If I just type HXD, hit enter, I'll get an error. Now this is a PowerShell error. You may have seen one of these blocks of red before as you played around in PowerShell. But basically it's telling us up here, I don't know where this program is. If I do the same thing in the command prompt, HXD, you'll see that it can't find it either. The error is a little bit different. In this case, it says HXD is not recognized as an internal or an external command, operable program, or batch file. And so what happened is the command line shell looked through all the directories that were in the path to see if it could find that program by that name. So you might ask, well, where are all of those things? Well, I'll type this command in the command prompt. This is going to show us our path. Now, this is the search path on my personal computer. I have a lot of different programs on there, but if we look kind of carefully up here, you'll notice directories, and then a semicolon, and then another directory, and a semicolon. So this is a semicolon separated list of the directories that the operating system is going to look in when I tell it to run a program. It'll look in all of those. If it can't find a program by the name that I specified, then it will give me an error back. PowerShell does the exact same thing. In PowerShell, we can take a look at the path as well. The syntax is a little bit different just because of the way PowerShell works, but we'll find the path out there, and then I'm going to use a little PowerShell magic to format it a little bit easier to see. So you can see all of those directories that I look through. So we just demonstrated that if we type the name of a program in, and that program's not in the search path, we're going to get an error. That doesn't mean we can't run it from the shell. To run it from the shell, all we have to do is tell the shell where the program is. So let's go ahead and do that. In my case, my program happens to be in a directory called utilities. All right? I'm going to tell the program exactly where this is. It happens to be in the folder scripting utilities hxd.exe. That's the name of the program. This program is something we call a hex editor. So you can see if a program exists anywhere, we just have to tell the shell exactly where it is. So let's just review a little bit. If you try to run a program and the program isn't in the search path, you're going to get an error. The search path is a list of directories that the shell looks into to try to find programs to run when you just type the name of a program. You can modify the search path permanently or temporarily by changing your Windows configuration. If a program is not in the search path and you want to run it, you'll need to specify either an absolute path or a relative path to where that program resides. We'll talk more about paths in another lesson. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the PowerShell prompt. The shell, when we open it up, gives us information about what's going on. So the standard PowerShell prompt looks something like you see here. The first part of it, the green part there, says PS. That just tells us that we're running PowerShell. And actually, it tells us we're running PowerShell on the local computer that we're typing on. More on that later. The next piece in yellow there tells us what directory PowerShell is currently actively working in. We call that the current directory. And then finally, that greater than symbol at the very end indicates that PowerShell is ready for us to enter a command. If you enter a command and you end up with a double greater than prompt, PowerShell is telling you is that the command that you were typing in, you didn't complete it. It didn't have enough information to complete its task. You can fix that by simply typing the rest of the command and hitting enter. All right, let's play around with a couple more commands just for fun. We'll show you the difference between that relative and absolute path idea. Here we are. You can see that in my current computer, my directory is the scripting directory. Let me show you what my directories look like. You can see that my D drive, and I'm in my scripting folder, there is a folder in here called Utilities, and there's a folder called Data. In Utilities is that program called hxd.exe. If I were to look at the full path to this program, it would be d://scripting/utilities/hxd.exe. I'm in the current directory, scripting. So I could run the program as we did before, giving the fully qualified path. So d://scripting/utilities/hxd. Or I could give it a relative path. A relative path starts the path from my current directory. So the relative location from my current location would be utilities /hxd.exe. And you can see that ran that the same way. Since I was already in scripting, I could just tell the shell that I wanted to go to the subdirectory of utilities and then run hxd.exe from that. Okay, let's do something a little bit different. I'm going to change directories now. So the command cd changes directories. We'll talk a lot more about this in another module, but cd changes directories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change directories to utilities. Okay. Notice how my current directory changed to utilities. If you remember, hxd was in there. So if I type hxd.exe, that's going to run the program. Or we think it's going to. But it didn't. Okay, what happened? To avoid accidentally executing commands in the current directory, PowerShell requires you to use a relative path to any program that's in the current directory to execute it. Okay, so that was a long statement. What does that mean? Well, I want to do a relative path, or I could do an absolute path, but an absolute path would be a long way, right? I'd have to type d:\scripting\utilities\hxd. Let's talk a little bit about paths. There is a special path called the period. The period means this directory, or the current directory. So if I put a period in a path, it means the directory I'm currently in. So I could say from the directory I am currently in, run hxd.exe, and it'll work. Let me close that, get it out of the way. Let me show you something else that's kind of tricky. I'll introduce tab completion in just a minute, but if I just start typing H and press the tab key, PowerShell will try to figure out what I'm typing. And since nothing else started with H, it said, hey, you must mean hxd.exe. And notice it automatically filled in the current path for me. So I can just run the program. So tab completion is our friend. Let me show you how this differs a little bit from the cmd.exe. Let me change directories to the utilities directory. And now if I just type hxd in here, the command prompt doesn't have that same protection. Also noticed I didn't have to put the full file name in. From the regular command prompt program, even in the current directory, I can omit the exe or the com. All right, let's talk a little bit about just working with the shell a little bit. I already mentioned tab completion. I love tab completion. Tab completion allows us to type just a few characters of the thing that we want to type and let PowerShell figure out the rest. Remember the full path to the hxd program? I can enter that fairly quickly using tab completion. Look, I'm going to type d:, then \, or then the character S for scripting. Now I'm going to hit the tab key, and it automatically filled out scripting for me. Now I'll hit the U key for utilities and hit the tab key. Then I'll hit the H key and hit the tab key, and it filled it all out for me. So that's a whole lot less typing, and it'll also be accurate because it won't fill out anything that doesn't exist. Okay, some useful keystrokes that you might want to know working inside the shell. First of all, our up and down arrow keys are going to allow us to move up and down in the command history or up and down in the command line that we're going to do. The home and end keys move us to the start of the line or the end of the line respectively. The control left arrow and right arrow move us a word to the left or a word to the right. And I didn't put it in this, but the left and right arrow move us a character to the left and the character to the right. Enter executes a command. Control C stops a command in the middle of execution. And Control L clears the screen. Let's take a look at those. My screen's a little bit messy, so if I press Control L, that will clear the screen. If I want to redo the last command that I just did, I can press the up arrow, and that's going to bring the last command back. Let's now talk a little bit about the history. PowerShell has a built-in history. By default, it'll keep track of about the last 4,000 commands. You can scroll through those commands with the up and down arrow key, and we can also search those commands with a Control R or Control S. Let's take a look at those just a little bit. My up and down arrow allows me to go through all of my commands. I can press Control R and search backwards. Maybe I want to search for N. Notice it found an N in scripting there. I really like the history feature, especially if I need to modify a command that I did before. So this is not a long command, but you'll maybe get an idea. The command ARP, if I type ARP, I got the help. ARP says that I might want to put a -A in there in the menu. So I could type ARP-A, or I could have just hit the up arrow and added the -A because I already had ARP in the last command. Now obviously ARP is really short, so we didn't save many keystrokes, but if that were a very long complex command, it'd be much more efficient to just go up in the history and edit the command to do the thing that I wanted it to do. Alrighty, I hope that was a good little overview of just working in the shell and what shells do. If you have any questions, make sure you post them online and we'll help you out. Remember, the key to getting good at PowerShell is practice. Get in that shell, type things, try commands, get comfortable.